Picture a narrow stone cottage in the year 1347, its walls blackened with smoke, the rushes on the floor crunching beneath nervous feet. A girl named Margot, not yet 15, stands barefoot in the flicker of tallow candles. Her woolen shift, sewn by her mother and worn by women of her line before her, feels heavy against her chest as she clutches it tight. Tonight she's been handed from one household to another, her body pledged in exchange for 3 pigs and half an acre of barley. At her side is Henrik, her husband, nearly twice her age, chosen not for love, but for his ability to provide. His face, carved by years of labor and weather, hovers close. Outside the thin timber walls, the wedding guests wait, drunk on ale, banging pots, and singing bawdy verses. Their laughter is not mere celebration. They wait for proof, for the sounds that will confirm that the marriage is real. This was no private moment. In medieval Europe, the marriage bed was a stage, the community its audience. Before bride and groom could even approach each other, they were led through the bedding ceremony, a ritual that seems shocking to modern eyes. Guests would march the couple into their chamber, strip them to their shifts, and deposit them in bed with noisy cheer. In some places, the revelers lingered, joking, watching, making certain the ritual was not left incomplete. Only when convinced that consummation would follow did they finally withdraw, often remaining outside the door, listening for cries of pain or pleasure. For Margot, there was more at stake than personal dignity. Her virginity was her father's bargaining chip, her family's honor distilled into flesh. A bride whose sheets were not bloodied risked being shamed, returned to her family, or worse. Some desperate girls resorted to pricking their fingers or smuggling in animal blood to stain the linen. The stakes were high. Marriage contracts hinged on consummation. Without it, the union might be annulled, the alliance dissolved, the bride branded as deceitful. The custom of displaying the sheets the following morning reinforced the public nature of what was supposed to be the most private of acts. A bloodstain became a ledger mark, proof that the bride had been intact, that the bargain was fair. Virginity itself became a currency, traded between families like livestock or land. Yet beneath this ritual lay profound ignorance. Medieval medicine insisted the hymen was a solid barrier that entirely sealed the female body, torn only by sexual intercourse. In truth, anatomy was far more complex. Riding horses, lifting heavy loads, or simple variants could alter the tissue. But such knowledge was absent, and so young women like Margot bore the crushing weight of a false science and an unforgiving community. Henrik's friends outside would not disperse until they were satisfied. They would drink until they heard what they expected. Margot's sobs, the confirmation of pain. This was not seen as cruelty. To them, it was ceremony, the fulfillment of social and spiritual duty. Only then would they stagger into the night, leaving the couple to the silence of their smoky room. But that silence carried its own terrors. Margot knew what the priest had preached, that even within marriage, the act about to occur could be sinful. Too much desire, too much joy, even between husband and wife, was branded as adultery of the spirit. Saint Jerome had warned centuries before, "He who loves his wife too ardently is an adulterer." Margot had absorbed these teachings from her mother's whispers, from confession, from the constant drone of clerical warnings. Her body was not only her husband's possession, it was a battlefield where the fate of her soul would be decided. And so she stood trembling between 2 sentences. Refuse Henrik, and she would face his wrath in a world that sanctioned a husband's violence. Submit on a forbidden day or in the wrong manner, and she might doom her soul to eternal fire. For her, the bedding chamber was not only a cage, but also a courtroom, with God, neighbors, and family all demanding their due. The medieval bedroom was not a sanctuary of intimacy. It was a contract, a test, a spectacle, and a confession booth all at once. To modern eyes, Margot's fear might seem exaggerated, but in her world, it was the weight of centuries. Religion, law, superstition, pressing down on a girl's bare shoulders. As Henrik reached for the cord at her neck, loosening the shift her mother had sewn, the flickering candlelight revealed more than a frightened child and her husband. It revealed the collision of a society's deepest anxieties. Purity as property, faith as surveillance, desire as danger. Margot's chamber was no private refuge. It was the stage upon which the entire village, the church, and even heaven itself demanded proof. This was not love. This was survival, transaction, and submission, played out under the shadow of eternity. Margot's wedding night was not the end of her ordeal. It was the beginning of a lifetime of regulation. In her world, desire was never her own. Every touch, every embrace, every sigh could be weighed against the scale of sin. The church, that unblinking eye of medieval life, dictated not only where and with whom sex could occur, but also how, when, and why. Clerics like St. Jerome had already poisoned the well centuries earlier. His infamous declaration that a husband who loved his wife too ardently was no better than an adulterer hovered like a curse over every marriage bed. Passion itself was suspect. To the medieval mind, even in the sanctity of wedlock, excessive pleasure was a kind of treason against God. By the mid-13th century, these suspicions hardened into rules. Thomas Aquinas, the great Dominican theologian, codified them in his Summa Theologica. For couples like Margot and Henrik, the list was suffocating. No intimacy during Lent, Advent, or on holy feast days. No coupling on Sundays, Fridays, or Wednesdays. None while pregnant, menstruating, or breastfeeding. The approved position was singular. Man on top, woman beneath, face to face. Anything else was branded against nature. The punishment was not a slap on the wrist, but eternal damnation. If every prescription were obeyed, a married couple might legally come together only a handful of times a year. Priests estimated about 50 days remained free of prohibition. 50 nights out of 365. Imagine Henrik reaching for Margot on a Wednesday in Lent. She would face a tormenting choice: yield to her husband's demand and risk her soul, or refuse him and risk his fury. And fury was permitted. Domestic violence, so long as it enforced obedience, was not just tolerated, it was law. Adding to this weight was medieval medicine, steeped in the errors of antiquity. Physicians taught that women were imperfect men. Their bodies were thought to be inside-out versions of the male form. The vagina was a reversed penis, the ovaries hidden testicles. A grotesque simplification, yet one that shaped how men saw women's worth. Medical texts insisted that female orgasm was required for conception, leading to the cruel belief that rape could not result in pregnancy. If a woman conceived, it was taken as proof she had secretly desired her attacker. Courtrooms repeated this fallacy, turning women's suffering into their own condemnation. And then there was the wandering womb, a phantom illness passed down from Greek antiquity. Physicians claimed a woman's uterus could detach and travel through her body, strangling her heart or suffocating her lungs. Treatments ranged from absurd to cruel, fumigating the vagina with sweet herbs to lure the womb back into place, or pressing foul smells to the nostrils to drive it downward. Margot's mother might have whispered of these terrors, warning her that her body itself could betray her. Menstruation, too, was a monthly curse in more ways than one. Ancient writers like Pliny the Elder were still trusted authorities. He claimed menstrual blood could wither crops, dull blades, or drive animals mad. Medieval scholars took these claims at face value. Women on their cycles were banned from altars, barred from handling food, and sometimes sent to outlying huts until purified. Priests preached that menstruation was God's punishment for Eve's disobedience, each cycle a reminder of original sin written in flesh and blood. Physicians, trapped in their own ignorance, feared that menstrual flow left the body poisoned if not properly expelled. They prescribed bloodletting, purges, or even intercourse as cures, suggesting that male seed might neutralize the toxicity. Imagine the horror of a girl told that the remedy for her cramps was not rest, but submission. Yet women resisted in their own ways. They passed down secret wisdom, moss packed into cloth for protection, herbs to soothe cramps, lunar calendars scratched into wood to track cycles. Hidden knowledge, whispered from mother to daughter, carved out pockets of agency in a world where male authority declared the female body dangerous, unclean, and incomprehensible. For Margot, every day was a test. In a single candle-lit room, with neighbors' ears at the wall and priests' rules hovering like swords, intimacy became an obstacle course. She was told her womb could wander, her blood could spoil wine, her pleasure could doom her soul. And yet she was expected to produce children, to prove fertility, to keep the family line alive. The contradictions were endless, but the punishment for failure was always the same: shame, blame, and damnation. The medieval bedroom was not a place of rest. It was a courtroom, a confessional, a battleground of invisible laws. For Margot, and for countless women like her, every kiss was weighed against eternity. If the church ruled the calendar and priests patrolled the conscience, it was women, quietly, secretly, who carried the burden of survival. Beneath the weight of prohibitions, an underground knowledge persisted, a fragile chain of herbs, charms, and whispered remedies passed from mother to daughter, from wise woman to bride. In the forests outside villages like Margot's, women gathered by moonlight, collecting plants believed to hold power over life and death. Pennyroyal, tansy, and rue were among the most common, brewed into bitter teas to prevent pregnancy. But these were double-edged remedies. The difference between a contraceptive dose and a lethal one was terrifyingly thin. A few sips might forestall conception. A few more might still a heartbeat, sometimes the unborn child's, sometimes the mother's. Other tools of protection came in the form of amulets. The mandrake root, with its uncanny human-like shape, was prized as a talisman of fertility. To wear one close to the skin was thought to increase chances of conceiving. Its rarity made it precious, and so markets filled with forgeries, carved from briny roots to resemble the real thing. The church condemned these practices as witchcraft, but faith and desperation often mingled in ways that no sermon could undo. A woman might cross herself before Mass and hide an amulet beneath her bodice all in the same day. Superstition bled into daily ritual. Some women were told to jump backwards 7 times after intercourse, or to drink wine mixed with crushed bees, in hopes of avoiding conception. Others buried after birth beneath the threshold of their home to ensure future fertility. In villages across Europe, sacred and profane existed side by side. A mother might pray to St. Margaret for safe childbirth, while tying a piece of amber between her breasts as protection against miscarriage. Survival demanded flexibility more than faithfulness, but there was no safety here. Miscalculation could mean poison, infertility, or death. And yet, women risked it, because the alternative was equally brutal. Childbirth in the medieval world was a deadly lottery. 1 in 3 women would perish giving life. And for those who carried children outside of marriage, the punishment was not only personal, but social. Ostracism, exile, sometimes execution. Infanticide, though condemned, was whispered of as a desperate woman's last resort. The contradiction was striking. The church thundered against contraception and abortion, yet urban authorities quietly tolerated prostitution. Cities across Europe licensed brothels, regulating the very practices the pulpit condemned. Prostitutes, marked by distinctive clothing or confined to specific quarters, became an open secret. Official sinners whose bodies were exploited for civic order. Priests preached damnation, while magistrates collected taxes. Here too lay peril. Brothels were hotbeds of disease, violence, and exploitation. Yet for some women, they offered a grim form of autonomy, earning coin, however meager, in a society that left little room for choice. The tension was everywhere. Between public condemnation and private indulgence, between law and survival. And then there were the darker symbols, born of fear rather than reality. The chastity belt, likely rare, but remembered vividly, embodied male terror of female autonomy. Whether crafted of leather or iron, real or imagined, it represented the obsession with controlling women's bodies. Its image haunts us, not because it was common, but because it reveals the extremes of anxiety that governed sexuality. Even in moments of festivity, fertility remained at the center. The spring celebration of May Day carried echoes of older pagan rites. Young men and women ventured into the woods under cover of collecting flowers. But the night's true purpose was less innocent. Songs and dances cloaked a freedom denied on all other days. Many births the following February were quietly attributed to the blossoms gathered that May morning. The church tried to suppress these rites, branding them immoral, but the people persisted. Desire, like ivy, grew where it could, winding its way through cracks of prohibition. For Margot, these currents were invisible, yet omnipresent. She would hear whispers in the market of teas that could fix a mistake, or charms to ensure a male heir. She would see older women slip into the forest under the full moon, carrying baskets that smelled of bitter herbs. She would learn to recognize the unspoken looks between mothers, the guarded nods of solidarity. This was not rebellion in the open sense. It was quiet resistance, a shadow economy of knowledge, one that might preserve her life, or end it. The irony was bitter. The same society that condemned women for seeking control over their bodies also forced them to bear the risks of childbirth, disease, and dishonor. Between priest and apothecary, between church bell and moonlit grove, women navigated an impossible terrain. Their choices were laced with danger, but necessity made them unavoidable. The flicker of candlelight in Margot's room might hide more than her fear of Henrik's touch. It might conceal the small pouch of herbs her mother had tucked into her dowry chest, or the whispered instructions passed in the crowded lane outside church. These fragments of secret knowledge were lifelines in a world where survival was rationed, and where every body was both battlefield and currency. If superstition and secret remedies haunted Margot's nights, the cold machinery of law ruled her days. The medieval world treated sexuality not as private choice, but as public property. A woman's body was a ledger entry in the accounts of men. Her father, her husband, her lord. And when transgressions occurred, justice was less about protecting her than preserving their honor. Rape, for example, was not defined as a crime against the woman. It was a theft from the man who owned her. If a peasant girl was assaulted by a nobleman, her attacker might pay a modest fine, little more than the cost of damaged livestock. But if a peasant touched a noblewoman, The punishment could be mutilation, torture, or death. Justice bent with the curve of hierarchy. Adultery revealed the same cruelty. A married woman caught with another man could be killed by her husband on the spot without consequence. Her lover might face mutilation, but the woman bore the full brunt of dishonor. A husband, by contrast, was free to consort with servants, prostitutes, or unmarried women, provided he did not interfere with another man's property. The double standard was written into the marrow of the law. Even consummation itself became a legal matter. The Church insisted that a marriage was not binding until proven through intercourse. Priests and judges were drawn into the most intimate details. Husbands and wives might be questioned separately, neighbors interrogated about what they heard through thin walls, and women's bodies inspected for signs of penetration. The law peered into the bedchamber as though it were a courtroom, and when marital unions faltered, impotence trials exposed men to their own humiliations. Husbands accused of being unable to consummate their marriages were forced to prove themselves before officials. In some cases, they were ordered to attempt intercourse under observation, or their genitals inspected by physicians. Masculinity itself became subject to legal scrutiny, though even here, class tilted the scales. A lord might quietly arrange an annulment. A poor man might be ruined by ridicule. Fear itself became a kind of policy. Communities were trained to watch and whisper. Neighbors acted as informants, gossip functioning as both surveillance and punishment. Confession, too, was transformed into a tool of control. Priests pressed penitents for intimate details. How often, in what position, at what times of year. The boundaries of private life collapsed beneath the weight of clerical interrogation. By the 13th century, the Inquisition sharpened this scrutiny into something darker. Manuals instructed inquisitors to ask not only about heretical belief, but about sexual practice, whether couples lay face to face, whether pleasure lingered too long, whether forbidden acts had been attempted. Torture extracted confessions, and rumors of misbehavior could spiral into charges of witchcraft. The line between sinner, victim, and sorceress was perilously thin. Demons filled the gaps that law and doctrine could not explain. The succubus and incubus were not dismissed as folk tales, but treated as accepted dangers. A man who experienced nocturnal emissions might believe he had been seduced by a succubus. A woman waking in the grip of sleep paralysis might be branded as a consort of demons. Theologians even spun elaborate theories that demons could collect semen in female form, then shift shape into males to impregnate women. Any child of such a union, they declared, was cursed. Imagine Margot lying awake in her small chamber, paralyzed in fear after a nightmare. To us, it would be sleep paralysis. To her, it might be proof of demonic assault, an experience she dared not confess, lest neighbors whisper that she herself had welcomed the demon. Fear was not just in the law books. It seeped into the body, the dreams, the silences of the night. The machinery of control was relentless because it was everywhere. In the sermon, the confession booth, the gossip of neighbors, the authority of fathers and lords. Sexuality was policed, not by a single hand, but by an entire network of eyes, ears, and voices. For Margot, every step carried risk. A refusal could be rebellion. A pregnancy could be damnation. A nightmare could be witchcraft. Her body was no longer hers. It was evidence, property, a battlefield on which honor, law, and salvation clashed. The true terror was not the candlelit silence of her wedding night. It was knowing that silence itself could not protect her. The village, the priest, and even unseen demons claimed a stake in her body. If the law turned bodies into property and the church made desire a sin, then what of love? Did it exist at all in Margot's world, or was it smothered entirely beneath fear and obligation? The truth is stranger than a simple yes or no. Love was there, but it wore masks, played in shadows, and lived on in whispers and rebellion. Among the nobility, love took on an almost unreal form: courtly love. In the poetry of troubadours and the tales of knights, love was celebrated as a holy torment, a yearning for a lady one could never truly possess. Real marriage was about alliances, estates, and heirs. But in verse, love was exalted as something purer, existing outside wedlock, unconsummated and unattainable. A knight might dedicate his battles to a lady's favor, yet never hope to lie beside her. For the elite, the heart was split in two: marriage for duty, longing for the soul. For peasants like Margot, there was little room for such luxuries. Marriages were bargains struck between families. A girl's preferences were rarely consulted, yet desire still found its cracks. At May Day festivities, in the secrecy of barns, in hurried encounters while parents or masters looked away, young men and women carved out moments of choice. Bundling boards, wooden planks placed between engaged couples sharing a bed, were intended as tests of virtue, but they often served as invitations to experiment. The boundaries between chastity and rebellion blurred in the dark, and there was laughter too. While priests thundered about the dangers of lust, taverns echoed with bawdy songs, and travelling minstrels recited fabliaux, comic tales of lustful wives, bumbling husbands, and scandalous liaisons. These stories were not simply jokes. They were acts of resistance, mocking the solemnity of church law and reminding listeners that desire was stubborn, impossible to chain. Medieval science, too, tried to explain and contain love. Physicians claimed that compatibility rested in the balance of humors, hot or cold, wet or dry. A hot man matched with a cold woman might achieve balance, while two cold spouses could spell infertility. Even the stars were enlisted. Conception during certain lunar phases was thought to produce boys, during others, girls. The cosmos itself was drafted into the project of regulating desire. And yet, across classes, intimacy was shaped not just by rules, but by space. Nobles enjoyed private chambers with thick walls and tapestries, where secrets could remain secret. Peasants, by contrast, lived crowded in single-room cottages, where intimacy occurred within earshot of children, servants, even animals. Privacy was a luxury of wealth. For most, it simply did not exist. Still, even within these suffocating constraints, humanity pressed through. Lovers risked their reputations for a stolen touch. Husbands and wives, despite the restrictions, found tenderness in the small moments, sharing warmth under rough blankets, whispering in the night. Some women learned to manipulate the rules themselves, feigning illness on forbidden days to gain respite, or cleverly invoking church prohibitions to delay unwanted advances. Resistance took many forms, sly, subtle, and often invisible to the very systems designed to crush it. Margot's world was one of impossible contradictions. She was told that pleasure was sinful, yet urged to bear children. She was watched constantly, yet expected to be silent. She lived in fear of demons, yet laughed at tales that mocked priests. Her body was currency, yet her heart still longed for connection. As we return to her chamber, Henrik's calloused hand reaching, the candlelight wavering on stone walls, we see more than a frightened bride. We see the collision of an entire civilization's anxieties: purity, honor, salvation, survival. Her trembling hands and his heavy breath contain within them the weight of law, superstition, community, and love's stubborn persistence. For in the end, despite centuries of prohibitions, fear, and control, desire endured. It found its way into poems, into secret gardens, into laughter behind tavern doors. The medieval bedroom may have been a battlefield, but even there, humanity reached for tenderness. Margot's story is not simply one of oppression. It is also a testament to resilience, that love, however constrained, can survive even in the locked rooms of history.